I'm DeForrest Brown Jr. For the last 7 to 8 years, I've been living in New York after leaving Alabama to do what I've been calling kind of investigating the future. After seeing the 2008 housing crisis at the year that I started college, but also seeing the student debt loan crisis like rising, seeing the Occupy Wall Street movement up here, but also like the burgeoning indie music scene that gave us like Animal Collective and Grizzly Bear and all these like other indie bands that are winning Grammys now that we've already forgotten about because they're too popular. Yeah, I saw all of these kind of developments happening and decided, what the hell, I'm going to move up to New York and see it on the ground. I wanted to see, where all of this excitement was happening. I wanted to see, well, for one, the original capital of the country, like kind of possibly slip into a collapse due to an economic disaster that we really haven't acknowledged yet, speaking to the 2007 and 2008 housing crisis. But obviously, if you look outside of these city walls out to the Midwest and like places like Arizona, you will see that the the effects of that recession are still with us, and in fact, they've accumulated to a point at which we can no longer not acknowledge. I mean, the same as recognizing that this land that this man-made island that we call Manhattan used to be native territory. We have to acknowledge all of those things, and yeah, I came here with the sort of on a mission to track the progression of these things, to track the New York City liberals that were running all these magazines, Vice magazine, BuzzFeed magazine, Pitchfork, like they were all here, and I wanted to see where the technocrats were. And 8 years down the road in 2020, it's been very interesting seeing COVID completely wipe away all of the sort of tech data oriented manipulative like marketing labor that so many New Yorkers put into play, and so many people in San Francisco and other like tech oriented companies and cities. Like it's interesting to see that the best that the technological revolution could do was lock us all up inside of our houses and use Zoom to communicate, and neither the president nor the American people will acknowledge that maybe eating outside isn't the best idea at this point in history. But anyway, that's what this talk is for. And that's what this book is for, Assembling a Black Counterculture. I originally didn't plan to write this book, but the publisher, Primary Information, kind of reached out and had seen the work I was doing with Make Techno Black Again, and I've been friends with one of the co-founders for a while, James Hoff, who has released Unpan and is currently represented by Callicoon Gallery down in on Delancey. And yeah, he had seen the work and was like, this sounds like an interesting book coming from a media theorist who also has been kind of invested in techno, but also comes from the South, where so many of the sounds, the indigenous sounds that I say Black indigenous sounds with a sense of purpose that went into techno, so blues, gospel, some of the big band sounds that eventually like morphed into jazz. Yeah, and this book was an opportunity to pull all of these histories together. I mean, especially after the 2016 election, everyone was buying Hillbilly Elegy, and here we are now. Everyone's on Netflix watching Hillbilly Elegy as if, so that we can learn something about the rest of America, learn something. And the problem isn't out there per se. It's with where the money is. It's here in a city with Wall Street, in a city with, many universities in a part of the country with many elite universities like Harvard and Yale. We can go down the list of these like elite universities that all copied Harvard structure in order to educate the masses or the elite masses in a very specific manner after colonizing this land. And so with all of this said, I worked with the artist Abdul Kadam Hawk, who recently worked on the Drexia graphic novels and has done art for many of the original Detroit techno artists like Juan Atkins, Carl Craig, and so on. And yeah, I reached out to him on Facebook and asked him to do this cover because I wanted to make sure that the book was true to what the specific situations of what had taken place in Detroit, to like the conditions that led to techno being a necessity, and later on to Trump and former New York Mayor Giuliani attacking Wayne County as being a place that, whose votes don't matter because it's a majority of black citizens who white citizens left to die after the economic crash that happened there, the auto industry crash, and the race riots of '67. Um, so it's I really wanted to talk to someone who was indigenous to Detroit, while also matching my experiences growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, only blocks like away from the 16th Street Baptist Church where the four little girls were bombed by white supremacists and a CIA agent. Yeah, and it just, yeah, having these conversations with this futurist and illustrator kind of led to this painting, but also that is now the cover of the book, but also helped kind of direct a more open vision of the future. I wasn't interested in my vision of the future, which is very cynical, just due to history. If you look at history in a straight line, it looks like a lot of bullshit. Let's just be honest here. American history, I'll say, the last 400 years haven't been pretty. It's been a lot of murder, a lot of money laundering, a lot of sick stuff that we're paying for right now with COVID. Um, and it, and he and I, one of the things that Abdul Kadam Hawk and I talked a lot about was what kind of future could come from a civilization that formed from so much trauma and brutality, and we'll say a smidge of stupidity. But also, I mean, jumping into things like, I mean, if you look at, actually, let's do this. I'll go through, I always forget to go through the charts. So first slide is political activist and theorist of automation, or early theorist of cybernetics and automation, James Boggs, who is from a part of Alabama where I'm from. He was there in the 1940s and moved up to Detroit after doing some like agricultural work in the West, to get away from the KKK, which had been plaguing my part of Alabama and the black community that is left there for quite a while. He was tired of the Jim Crow segregation laws, which designated black people as not just unable to integrate into white the metropolitan society that it built up in Birmingham, but also somewhat designated us as non-human, as well as the classic argument of, well, civil rights movement was for voting rights. It wasn't for voting rights. It was for the right to be human. Voting is just a way for us for black people to influence the white ideology and the white bureaucratic buffering system that we call voting, and voters into seeing us legally as human. But yeah, as you see here, James Boggs, he started working as a unionized worker at Chrysler and began to take notes into his first, which became his first book, The American Revolution, the Negro, or Pages from a Negro Worker's Notebook. And yeah, he says in a separate essay that he gave at a conference on cybernetics in '63, I believe, in each industry where machinery played a vital role, the Negro played a special role, that of being the last to be recruited, and usually on an emergency basis of war. Well, e.g. war. He goes on to say, and let me move this. Okay, he goes on to say, the revolution which is within these people will have to be a revolution of their minds and hearts, directed not towards increasing production, but toward the management and distribution of things, and toward the control of relations among people, tasks which up till now have been left to chance or in the hands of an elite. I mean, what that can mean in a lot of ways is, I mean, I like to start, well, James Boggs in this book wrote about the New Deal, which is kind of funny because he's from Alabama, moved up north, became very disenchanted with northern liberal diplomacy, and yeah, he came to a lot of the same conclusions that I had, that the New Deal was, in fact, kind of a scam by the US government, where you have a bunch of people after the bankers, like during the Great Depression, I mean, you have a bunch of bankers just like lose all of the money of the people, and everyone's sleeping in tents. You have of mice and men where they're out there like, rolling through dust bowls trying to find jobs like as like farmers and stuff. And it's people, if you've seen the movie Cinderella Man, that's really great and sensational kind of image of what things were like. Or I mean, you can turn to the news right now and see the food lines, like the thousands of people in food lines out in like Arizona. I mean, we're living in these like in the failure of capitalism right now, and we don't have to point to old literature to see what we're living through or to get a representation of it. But yeah, we came to the conclusion that the New Deal was kind of a way. It was a nice thing by Roosevelt, which is why we have the FDR Highway in New York. But it was a way for the government to enlist the American people into investing into capital. You have these pre-planned homes that like the suburbs that people are moving into. They're leaving the urban centers where economic crises were continually happening um, for something more stable. And that's something that happened in the city of Detroit was after the crisis or the auto industry collapse. People moved out into like places like Bellevue and like further out into the suburbs of Michigan, leaving the city of Detroit in a continual bankruptcy for the next 40, 50 years. And I'll move on to the next slide to kind of actually we'll skip all of this and go straight to this slide from Drexia, who was a band or electronic duo from the 90s. They made a sort of mysterious techno that was only found like on vinyls released through Underground Resistance, sometimes through labels like Tresor or Warp. But it's not only is it music, but it's also a sort of engraved myth that can be derived from liner notes or various like single phrases that were etched onto the vinyl, and it told the story of the transatlantic slave trade and how pregnant women and babies, sick babies, were thrown overboard by the European colonizers and slave owners for maybe just for being extra cargo. Maybe it was they were sick and didn't want to spread sickness throughout the rest of the slave labor inventory. And yeah, they threw these people overboard into the water. And James Denton and Gerald Donald, who were a part of the Drexia project, and Abdul, who was illustrating, had a sort of hopeful tale of these people not just drowning and dying as what most likely happened, but that they were able to adapt, that they were able to grow gills and to become one with the ocean and to become a strong race of people, like called the Drexians. And my book, to the side of this, tries to posit Black people as the sort of land dweller companions of the Drexia, or not even companions, maybe foils. And Drexia's releases on Underground Resistance were supposed to be seen as a sort of aquatic counterstrike initiative that was in alignment with the land dwellers of Underground Resistance. It was meant to be a sort of Underground Resistance and Drexia together were a sonic warfare force that was attacking colonizers across the world, attacking European listeners or ravers who had been misappropriating and desecrating the original intentions of techno, which was, to be frank, a bunch of lonely Black men in the middle of a destroyed city playing with cheap gear, cheap discontinued like drum machines and synthesizers that they picked up from pawn shops. So that was left over from Motown being in Detroit, which Motown left to move to LA in 1972. And there was an underground sort of post-disco scene that continued well after that. But going to this chart here, see, James Denson starts the chart at 1655 here, but I like to start it at 1619 to align with Nicole Hannah Jones's 1619 project at the New York Times Magazine, which, if you have not looked into that project, I highly recommend it as a sort of guided text through how our current understanding of the previous normal was built on fascist, Nazi-like understandings of who is or who can and can't be designated as human or currency. And so yeah, Stinson starts a story here with the slave trade, and I should say actually this chart was found in their 1979 or 1997 album The Quest, which is the first compilation of tracks that they've ever put together into a vinyl. It's no longer available now, so I like to share this chart because people may not otherwise see it. But you see here that down in the south, Alabama and Georgia, Mississippi. That's the Black Belt region where the soil there was. It was called the Black Belt because the soil was really fertile. It produced a lot of cotton, a lot of like materials that would go into the initial investments and of material trades that would get the American economy started, at least for like the Confederate states down south. And the Civil War was fought over not just those materials, but also the inherent value of Black people, West Africans turned Black people as machines. So when we talk about reparations, we're not talking about giving us money for the trauma. It's not about that. You can't pay that back. What you can do is go through charts of slave owners, go through their, their bank statements and say, okay, this is how much a Black body was approximately worth, and every Black person gets that amount of whatever people were paying for these Black people. Like this is our, like, that's what the Civil War was about. Was you have thousands of machines, essentially machine people that are running free, that can't be owned, can't be utilized, can't be gambled, can't be traded, can't be degraded. And when you think about things like Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, what you're seeing is something kind of like, I don't know if you remember that time last year when JP Morgan Chase, there was one of their ships were found in a harbor in Boston containing a few $billion worth of cocaine. It's kind of like that to see a slave walking around in, Michigan in the middle of like 1840. And it's, yeah. Anyway, Techno picks up, actually, let's go back here for a sec. Techno was kind of formulated by Juan Atkins around 1980 after reading Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave, and was released globally on a compilation called Techno, the New Dance Sound of Detroit in 1988. And let's fast forward a bit to this. Toffler is an interesting guy. He's a futurist and businessman that wrote a number of books and participated in a number of interviews, effectively trying to warn Americans of their haphazard way of colonizing a land that was meant to be regulated by trees, living things. Trees are living things that create oxygen and work together. They exchange water, they grow in families, they actually do recognize hierarchical family structures. And, European settlers decide to come in, cut them all down, and build these temporary, like, kind of pathetic structures we call skyscrapers, these buildings, these ornaments. And as you see here, Toffler builds a chart, also using Buckminster Fuller's term spaceship Earth here, in which Buckminster Fuller suggests that people, scientists, can steer the Earth and use the Earth as if it's like a thing to be used, and it's not. It's a thing that we're just on. And when you start to use the Earth as an object, when you start to use people, Black people, as objects, you start getting some interesting kickbacks, because, I mean, we are not machines, and the Earth is not a spaceship. The Earth is the Earth, and Black people are people. But one of the reasons I like to show this chart is because what Toffler shows is the stages, the four stages of civilization, and that can be applied to Babylon, the Ottoman Empire, more specifically the Roman Empire. Not necessarily anything going on in the Eastern world, because that history is far longer and more dense than the Western world's by a long shot. But you have here, say, the first wave is nomadic peoples. And the thing is also, I want to take this chart and say that Toffler applied it to all civilizations, but I want to apply it specifically to European, Eurocentric oriented civilizations. And actually, I'll go back to these charts here to show that what I wanted to show is that there was a point in history around the 1700s in which Europeans thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. And Galileo came and was like, actually, it was, the sun is the center of the universe. And so you have this geocentric to heliocentric model that that's one of the many resets that Europe has had to do over the last 1,000 years of their supposed enlightenment after the collapse of the Roman Empire, let them run free into the Crusades and all the other tomfoolery that makes up, again, the 1,000 years of enlightenment. And I actually like to show this record of Sun Ra and his idea of heliocentric worlds and him placing himself in line with, oh, it wasn't Galileo, it was Copernicus. Because, yeah, and Kant uses the term the Copernican turn for this reason that, and I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that specifically Americans, but also Europe, need to participate and engage in a full paradigm shift away from whatever it is thought as normal. First off, that's over. COVID has ended that. The vaccine currently is not peer reviewed. It's not, approved by the FDA, and we've had a reality TV show host president for the last 4 years. So I think we all need to have a paradigm shift and rethink maybe what our future can look like and what we've been participating in for the last 80 years. So anywho, agricultural development is this point at which humans stop going through and picking up berries and doing the hunter-gatherer thing, and they start trying to build stable environments. This is the first mistake of humans, specifically Eurocentric or Germanic tribes that were developing their initial cultures, is to stand still and to pull from a single spot on the earth repeatedly until it's barren. That's not a smart move. After that, you have the industrial era picking up in the late 1700s, 1800s. And in America, specifically leading into the Civil War, you have basically cotton gin machines out producing and out working Black people who, Europeans went through the great trouble of like going into Africa, kidnapping people in their sleep and, dragging them like miles across the ocean and dropping them in into fields and forcing them to work 18 plus hours a day and eating pig slop as like food and beating them and like skinning them and turning them into chairs, or turning us into chairs. There's all sorts of things that happened in the South, in the Black Belt region, that is not told in our history. That, due to the fact that my great grandfather was a slave until 1930, I am lucky enough to have immediate memories or immediate storytellers or experiential stories of these things. My grandparents and my aunts were in the Million Man March. Martin Luther King was going down to Birmingham to help out my family. It wasn't just it wasn't just for all Black people. It was my family, in Birmingham, that was the specific hotspot of a lot of the racial violence happening in the country, along with the other 154 race riots and various insurrections that happened in the summer of 1967, while white people, hippies, were off in Haight-Ashbury taking acid and doing all that stuff. Anyway, the third wave is the information era, in which James Boggs was kind of predicting, in which automation would sort of do the same thing that the cotton gin motor did to Black people. Automation, he was afraid, would take the jobs of the lower class or the blue collar white people who were beginning to move up in the unions and actually gain a lot of oppressor power. And a lot of the Black people were getting pushed out of these roles at the factories. And yeah, Boggs was quite concerned about what the New Deal had offered, what kind of contract that it offered white Americans versus Black Americans who were being affected by redlining and so many other things. So here we are in the information era, years down the road, and we are all addicted to social media. We're addicted to streaming and binge watching TV shows. We're so addicted to this technology that we, again, don't notice that 260,000 people have died right in front of us across the country, that double that number will die in the next few weeks. And strangely enough, Techno is all about this. And I'll show you how in just a second. The fourth wave, which I should say that Trump campaign advisor Steve Bannon was also very interested in when he was pushing for Trump's win, is the fourth wave, or what Steve Bannon called the fourth turning, in which you see there's a few options here. There's a global consciousness era, which you will hear people like Elon Musk talk about as being singularity. And then there's the reality of COVID reality, which is this overshoot and collapse. So if you see here, this is 2020 right in here, and 2021 is down here, down further, as opposed to over here in global consciousness era. And so we as a people, as a nation of people, should probably be thinking about the fact that we are not working together to stay inside and curb a virus and are instead heading into a great, and as you see, a multi-century long development towards an overshooting collapse. And I'll say this like in this time scale here that America did all of these moves in 400 years using black people as the agricultural era, as opposed to the 1,000 years of Europe. And yeah, we just, I just want to make it clear that America is this, and Europe is like this, and then we can, the whole world is like this, um, in terms of development. So America has never had a collapse like this before, like the Roman Empire, and there's plenty of books that have pointed to the fact that America is heading towards this. But again, here we are. Um, this is what Juan Atkins had to say about Alvin Toffler, who he luckily got to read in a class called Future Studies in 1980. Um, and I'll read what he has to say, because why not? I go into Alvin Toffler and his comments concern. I got into Alvin Toffler and his comments concerning the electronic village. I considered that there had to be more than three waves and extrapolated the necessity of interfacing the spirituality of human beings into the cybernetic matrix between the brain, the soul, and the mechanisms of cyberspace. And this, I'll actually stop the presentation here. Or actually, no, I'll share the screen again, but I'll just kind of, yeah, it's fine. But that's kind of my idea of black sonic warfare, is this idea of a 19-year-old once cybernetic person. Juan Atkins, this 19-year-old kid, gets a 808 drum machine from a pawn shop for like probably $80 when it's normally like 800, and he starts making beats. And after reading Toffler and applying the word techno, which is short for technology, but could also be related to technocracy, or a government and society run by elite technical experts. You have this untechnical expert grabbing a machine and making techno, this like new form of like rhythm and blues music. Like his Juan Atkins' father was very much involved in promoting like jazz, blues, and funk shows throughout Detroit. Again, Motown was in Detroit. Like when I talk about things like Make Techno Black Again, I'm not just talking about the music. I'm talking about the technocracy, the technical expertise of how this land is run, the history of it, like all of it. We should make it all black and understand what was happening to black people, or what has happened and what is still happening to black people in this country, in full alignment with what has been done to the natives. And I'm proud to say that my father has been working, who's an economist and teaches business economics at a HBCU down south, and my mom's a social worker working with at-risk youth. And I'm proud to say that my parents are actively on the forefront of trying to help these people, or help people in Birmingham. That my dad is working on solar paneling patents, and working to get solar power into schools and into homes and onto native reservations. And it's something we've been talking a lot about, is how do we move forward now that we've allowed a reality TV show host to be our president for 4 years, and the best we could do was make fun of him on SNL? How do we move forward after the nuclear bomb wiped out 200 and 175,000 people respectively between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we consider ourselves to be civilized people? Yeah, how do we move forward knowing that over 100 black people were murdered by the police, and none of these police were charged, arrested, chastised? And I mean, in France, the police beat up a guy and they're charged within the week. So it's a thing where Americans, we got a lot to talk about. And it's the thing is, these talks used to be more about techno, it used to be more about the music and clubbing, but I haven't been to a club since February. So I think it's time to stop talking about the hedonism that Europeans, you know, and maybe this is where I stop the presentation, allow for some conversation, because there's a lot to get into here, and I think it's I don't know. Hopefully that explains where my work comes from in regards to black sonic warfare, and soon to be a sort of black unity, or a concept of like black unity.
Thank you, DeForrest. Yeah, I'm taking in all of what you said because it's so real, and I'm just glad that we have the opportunity for you to be here with us and ignite this conversation.
I've said that when I started this project of doing Black Sonic Warfare or just music in general, I've wanted to make everything music, and the rest of my life I just want to keep making everything music. Like, I mean, you hear from like people like Stevie Wonder, or like Isaac Hayes, or especially John Coltrane and Alice Coltrane, where like the whole like galaxies open up before you. And it is a lot because I mean, this is the entire story of our human history. If you want to isolate America to a single continent, um, and yeah, if it is a lot, that's the effect. The hope is that everyone kind of gets hit with this wave of information. We all kind of like exhale together, and then we talk about it, and we move forward into a Black unity. Because I should say also that when I say Black, I don't necessarily just mean African American. I also mean Black people from the Black Belt region. As like, if we were given any sort of land reparations, Black people would be in a situation like Palestine, in which we're locked away in the Black Belt region, Detroit and Philly, and some other like small spots. But also Black as in like a data set that is completely imperceptible, that is asymmetric, and just there's too much data to even account for. Um, and so yeah, in this moment, the hope is that we can start shedding some light on all of these rhizomatic like angles of information and trauma and yeah.
Yeah, it's rhizomatic for sure. We do have some questions coming through in the chat, and I like what you said. Like, as I'm trying to facilitate this, like I did feel like a wave had came over me, and I'm like, okay, I'm trying to breathe and talk through this wave right now. I'm really underwater. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it happens to me. Like even the opening clip, like I did that for my. You asked earlier, like if I would be performing through the first 3 minutes of like that clip, and I was like crying. Like that's what I was doing
mm,
instead of performing. Was just like
mm,
listening, and that's part of why I put the clip at the beginning was to remind myself where I was, like not just in that room, but like
mm.
amongst other people's experience. Like it's yeah,
It's a
yeah.
ritual. It's a ritual, and like you said,
Mhm.
it took place in a church as well. So a lot of like what we're doing, what we're creating, the music of Black people is ritualistic. It's rooted in our resistance and our survival. Um,
Yeah.
so I
Well,
want to
John,
read one of the questions.
I think the first one, Jaslyn from Nilufar, I think is a great transition to from what we were speaking about. That this is a lot. They ask, I'm interested in the reception and or discourse of your talks and presentations uh, that like that have started. What's your take on the reactions and overall intake of the presentations? So how do people receive this?
Well, I should start with this. A from a Most people, the expectation is that people receive things with from a place of empathy and a place of truth. So actually, just sitting down and going, if you're white and it hurts, good, you did it. So cool. Take the punch. Let's grow up and let's do it. Let's like go fix the last 1,000 years of your history. If you're Black, there's so much humiliation that it makes me want to cry right now thinking about it. And I don't want to get into all of the like one of the things I started doing after I was fired from Mixmag, which is one of the first electronic music magazines there was. Um, Back in 2017, I was fired for not fitting in and not fitting into the tech bro like model that they wanted me to fit into. And there's a great essay that I wrote called "How Dance Music Failed Black Artists" that can be found on their website. Um, that address this, and if you, that's one of the ways in which the reception. That's kind of the reception I get sometimes is people just going, "Here, just take it, just take the reins. I'm sorry." Um, the other way, when I first started doing these talks, the first one was at Unsound in Poland last October, and that recording can be found on my SoundCloud or Unsound's SoundCloud. I locked the doors, and I was like, international people, expats, all flying to Poland, gentrifying this area for a week of for some debauchery, maybe some intelligent conversation. You get to see some cool music, and I was like, cool. let's lock the doors and have a serious conversation now that you spent all this money and you're bothering these people. Let's talk about it. So the thing is, I don't actually care what people's reception is. It's actually about whether or not you're a human, whether or not you can actually reach inside yourself and empathize and go, wow, the history of Black people in America, as well as the African diaspora, as well as the Native genocide and the current like situation. Yeah, it's all so much that I would say the only way to respond should be empathy, but typically it's people just going, here you go, take the reins. I'm sorry. How do we move forward?
Thank you. I'll quickly, because we're running out of time, I'll quickly ask the next question.
Sorry.
No, I think it's really interesting, like this question of how one is received versus like, should we like really care about how one is received, and really think about like perception and like really how we sometimes shape shift into spaces depending on who is the audience and how one is expected to be fitting into this question spaces. But the question from Kari is, how do you navigate / think about existing in community with / working with non-Black people as you continue to develop your practice and release your work? How do you strike the balance with the reality in mind that allyship is, as it's been idealized, doesn't exist?
Kari, I'm going to be real with you. Yeah. Rule number one of working with non-whites or non-Black people when dealing with situations like decolonization, blackmail. You must blackmail the entire way through, or else you will not get anything. I'm sorry, white people, I'm sorry. It's just, the reason Mixmag allowed me to write the article I did was because I found out that Mixmag was going to do a thing called a blackout issue in which they covered and tried to, just talk about Black people and where techno came from. They really wanted to try to address it, and it was a really honest, genuine effort. But I sent a nice email and said, hey guys, as your one and only Black American employee, like in your American offices, who you unceremoniously fired 6 months after hiring, simply because you saw me roll a blunt at one of your parties, because that's what clubbing magazines do. They do a lot of partying. It's not intellectual at all. It's a bunch of UK football people with a lot of money that make deals with drink companies, like large, like Smirnoff. We got stacks of Smirnoff in the office every day, and everyone was expected to drink every day and to party at night afterwards. And I emailed them, was like, look, your environment is not Black friendly in the least, and or not even Black friendly. It's not people friendly. And I was like, I will be damned if you post an article celebrating Black people when you again unceremoniously fired the one Black employee you had without severance, without unemployment. They didn't even apply for the unemployment thing, so I could make that smidgen of cash like outside of that. And you know what? And I'll tell you this: that same summer was the summer that Eric Garner and Sandra Bland were killed. And I was really poor that summer after losing that job. I was in a basement in Queens working on what eventually became my first record with Kepler, Absent Personi. And all I did was watch the news, sit on Twitter, and like go through details about Black Lives Matter protesters being like killed, like after, everyone, after white people and everybody forgot about the protests. I read about the 8 and 9 different Black Lives Matter leaders who just randomly disappeared. And I'll say I was traumatized by that. And I was traumatized by what dance music had become over the 30 years of it coming from a Black community that were still recovering from these exact same traumas. And so again, going back to the question of like, how do people receive it? It's history keeps repeating in my life. I'm going through the same stuff my grandfather's going through in some senses. Luckily, I don't have to fight like white supremacist bombers with rocks the way that he did, but history is repeating itself, and yeah. So anyway, moving forward, I work with a lot of non-Black people. I'm signed to a British record label, Planet Mu. They support my music. I've been a fan of theirs for a while, so it's a lot of give and take where when I released Black Nationalist Sonic Weaponry, they gave half the label's entire proceeds away to the Movement for Black Lives and another charity for Black emotional and mental health. And like, so the label made no money off of Black Nationalist Sonic Weaponry, and I mean, they will now off the vinyl, but that's one of the things that I wanted to do. I also put together a PDF of, to go along with the album, of Black writers and thinkers that deserve so much more than, that deserve to be heard, that deserve to be writing about this music, to also contextualize where I was coming from and where they're coming from. And I'll drop a link to that PDF in here, because otherwise you'd have to buy the album to get it. But there's more context into that. There's a lot of context in there, and that's all I wanted to do. Was I simply just try to use these platforms to talk to everyone, including whites and Europeans, about the last 1,000 years, and we'll continue to do that. And as the Western world collapses into the second dark ages under the weight of COVID and the stupidity of what we call democracy, and because clearly there's not a democracy of like, what is it, 157 Black people are being killed by public authorities and no one cares. Again, 260,000 people are dying of COVID. Like, it just, we can't sit here and say we care if that's happening. Oh, sorry, there's another question. I'm interested to know more about your pedagogy informs the actual process of music making. Sorry, there's like, I'm always just like spilling so much information, but I was lucky enough to have a bunch of aunts that got like PhDs in like urban studies and social work. My mom has a master's in social work. My dad has a master's in economics and teaches that. And I was just lucky, like really, really lucky enough to just be surrounded by books, lots of text, like college textbooks that are older than the ones that we have right now, that don't really cut. They're not as friendly as some of the curriculums that we're dealing with now. We're talking like thick books, and I would just read them as a kid because I had nothing else to do. I was in Alabama, and in college, I should also say, I studied film theory and philosophy with a film theorist and a philosopher. The philosopher was he's kind of a master of Deweyan like educational structures, ethics, and religion, and the film theorist was again really into economics and psychoanalysis. So that got really interesting when we started psychoanalytically kind of looking at global economies of like film, and he would just like kind of start pointing out who's funding like the Marvel films, and just kind of go through it and be like, guys, what is this? So I don't know, and also 10 years of music journalism went into this, but yeah.
DeForrest, he was asking for some recs, but I'm seeing that Ting Ding just dropped a link.
Yeah. That's my partner. She's very helpful.
Wow, this is so great. Thanks for already sharing with us this like reading list.
Yeah, I was lucky. I was really glad that Crack asked about that reading list. And it was actually made ahead of the horse talk that we were talking about earlier in Belgium. But it's, that's just a list of all the books that I was reading that went into Black Nationalist Sonic Weaponry, and the book Assembling a Black Counterculture, and hopefully will lead people to similar conclusions as myself. Really interesting
Aaron was
questions.
just asking who your advisor was, as they sound lovely.
I think he identified as a Marxist. If you read the track titles on Black Nationalist Sonic Weaponry, I have a big problem with Marxists, mostly because Marx was too, he was chill, I guess. He didn't do anything about what was happening, but he wrote some nice books about it, right? And that's how academics do, right? They write some stuff, and that's the thing. I'm not trying to be. Anyway, I'm not going to shit talk Marx at a school because I know that it's mostly. I will say that James Boggs was a post-Marxist, and that he wrote that book. That book that I pointed out the American Revolution was actually it was a call out of a Marxist, of a white British male Marxist that he had been working with, who kind of soured on the black struggle and decided to go back to Britain and wanted to take control of the sort of communist socialist ideas that they were trying to propagate. And I mean, I lived with the Marxists after that horrific experience I told you about of getting fired from Mixmag. And he also tried to, this white male Marxist tried to take control over the house and run it like a small commune. And, you know, it's just colonialism all over again, right? And we have to like have paradigm shifts away from, I mean, the thing is, Marx couldn't predict COVID. Marx couldn't predict that we're all sitting here on Zoom, and he can't predict the stocks being as inflated as they are to the point where people don't even, yeah. But no, he was pretty good Marxist psychoanalytic. We were really into Althusser, if you like Althusser.
I can see that it always goes so fast.
Yeah, it does. I'm around.
But I think I just want to close with do we have time for one last question, Jazz? Or
yeah, I think it's fine. And like I'm also writing in the chat that we're going to go over and like have an after hours playing some music from Bandcamp in support of Bandcamp Friday, where 100% of the proceeds go to the artists. So yeah, we have time for like one last question and then we can transition into the after hours.
Great. I just wanted to read the question in the chat from
It's a good one.
Do you think the collapse is necessary for us to really start caring about people instead of profits?
If you want my honest answer,
yes,
it's I think we already have the answer to that question 9 months into the pandemic. And if you saw the expected, and I think actually the sales goals were met for Black Friday, it was $12.7 billion being spent by people who live in a country where a large part of the population can't feed their families and are going in food truck lines. Like, it's just, I think we got our answer. The ego death is not coming for America because America does not know what it means to lose. And that's something I should actually say this here, because this isn't, I think we all need to really consider the fact that there's a group of people in this country that have more rights than the rest of us. They have gone overseas and fought in wars, and they've seen and experienced ego deaths and traumas that we as civilians will never know. And that's kind of what these police officers are talking about. It's that trauma, it's the war trauma. And first off, the American people have not had an ego death since 9/11. And as you see, we didn't really deal with that one very well. We didn't deal with the ego death in 2008 very well. We just kept going. So I don't know what it takes for the American people to care. I'm really curious to find out myself. I was a lot more hopeful maybe in February than I am right now. I know it was like 5 months ago. But ego deaths are really important to Western civilization, I'll say. And that's actually, I should say, with the performance at the beginning of this, part of the reason the church was kind of an accident that fit in really well with my thoughts, but I've been noticing that a lot of Black Lives Matter protesters and just general dissenters of white supremacy have been calling out for justice in the name of Christ, in the name of Jesus, in the name of God. And I've been thinking, as a person who grew up Southern Baptist but doesn't necessarily practice religion or Christianity heavily, but still remembers all the stories, I thought it was really profound to go to the head of patriarchy, to go past the human and go to the patriarchal ideal, to God, and say, God, do something about these people. They keep going. But I'll say this in regards to that last question: the Drexia myth. It's not just for Black people. What James Denton was getting at was the hurricanes are part of the Drexian attacks. And if you notice, we've had the most hurricanes this year in American history. And those hurricanes, according to the Drexia myth, yeah, those are missiles. And it's a point where I think Americans need to start looking up and going, what are we doing to the climate? What are we, yeah. I'm done.
Thank you, DeForrest.
Jeez.
I'm just so glad that like this is the closing event of this series and of this year. You know, I think it was necessary, especially with all that has happened, or not just all that has happened this year, but all that has came to light this year.
Mhm.
Like you said, we need to keep shedding that light.
Yeah, I mean, I think about dealing with club culture as a way of like, I mean, Jesus would also deal with the beggars and the thieves and like the gamblers of society, and dealing with club culture and going over to club people and being like, look, I know you have this like liberation music. I know that Ronald Reagan went over to, Berlin and like tore down the wall and saved you guys from communism, and the first thing Berliners thought to do was like dance to like rave music in dungeons that they took from black people. But it's like, hey, yeah, it's like, look, we got to turn on the light in Berghain, turn on the light in these raves, and actually have a serious conversation. Because the last 30, if you look at club music from the 1990s when it reached Europe to now, it looks like 30 years of a psychotic break while people are shooting giant like missiles at each other. There's famines happening. Wars are being waged in Africa to harvest the materials we need for iPhones and PlayStations, and it's again, it's like no more clubbing. It's time to. I always think about the scene where Jesus goes and like starts flipping the tables in the temple after he sees like the preachers like gambling, and it's yeah, that's kind of the thought process.